Couple of concepts today. Concept number one is a word I'm sure you know already. The word is diversity. And it's a word that is a very much a buzzword, right, in popular culture. What do we mean by it in our everyday language? What's diversity when we're talking about, like, I don't know, maybe we're in social studies class or something like that. What do we mean by diversity? Types of people is usually what we're talking about. People from different ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, racial types. Diversity means having lots of different people, right? In biology, it's something much more all-encompassing. It basically means all the different types of species. Diversity is a measure of how many different species are there in that ecosystem. But ultimately, the meaning is the same, right? It means difference. Diversity means difference. And in biology, in ecology especially, what you will find is that, as a rule, higher diversity means healthier ecosystem. I want you to think about why that. And I should specify, by healthier ecosystem, what I mean is better able to survive change, better able to get through a disturbance intact. Because change is, always happening. And sooner or later, any ecosystem is going to go through disturbances. Whether they're what we consider natural disasters or not, there's going to be change. More diversity means they're better able to survive that change. Why do you think that is, Gavin?
I think that it's like if you have a food storage on one animal, then they could feed off.
Interesting. So you're thinking about food webs and food chains, and like if you were dependent completely on one food source and it went away, you're in trouble. Whereas if you have multiple, maybe you make it. It's a good thought. What else you got? More able to survive a disturbance when there's more different species. Why?
Some of those species might be able to adapt to that disturbance, but others
might already be adapted to that disturbance, right? The more different critters there are in that ecosystem, something bad happens. Forest fire sweeps through. Typically, that's a pretty destructive event, right? But the more different things you've got in that ecosystem, the more likely some of them make it. Some of them survive. Things that dig under the ground maybe survive a forest fire. Flying things, right? Maybe get away from the forest fire. If you only got 3 kinds of trees in your forest, I'd bet your forest fire means no more trees for a while. But if you have 100 different species of trees, suddenly it becomes much more likely that you've got one, not that can adapt, but that is already adapted. Do you know about the pine trees in forest fires? The pinyon pine is one of them. Not only, and they're always coniferous, with cone bearing. Not only do the pinyon pine's cones survive fires, the tree gets burned, but the cones, not only do they survive fires, they need a forest fire to open their scales and let their seeds out of their cones. It's crazy, right? But fire's a fact of life in the natural world. And this tree just happens to be adapted so that when that fire burns through and goes away, you got one tree that just replanted itself. And that tree dominates for a while. And that's its strategy, basically. Yeah. If you had the right kind, suddenly you've got plantable seeds. Absolutely. I know. So the more diversity you've got, the more likely you got something like the pinyon pine that is adapted to whatever disaster is coming through. And that's important to know because the more years go by, the more humans there are, the more we tend to change ecosystems, right? There's really not an ecosystem on Earth that hasn't been touched by humans. And most of them, you could say, we have disturbed them. And one of the primary reasons that we study ecology is to understand as we encroach on these ecosystems, because humans do what humans do, right? We clear land to live on, we use resources. The more of us there are, the more of those resources we use, we get those resources from ecosystems. So, of course, we are disturbing those ecosystems. The better we understand ecology, the better we understand how to help those ecosystems survive us. And we got to be careful when we study ecology that we don't kind of rush into things and just start trying things to fix ecosystems without knowing what's going to happen. Australia, that particular scenario you got Friday is a great example of that. Do you know what Australia did to try to fix its rat problem after rats got brought on ships to Australia? By the way, do you know how Australia first got European settlers? There were people already there, but the first white people, the first Europeans to get there.
Wasn't it, I believe it was the Brits, but I believe Australia was the Brits.
Yeah.
That's why they take off.
Yeah, it was a prison colony, absolutely. Yep, they sent their bad guys there. What a way to start settling. Yeah, what a bummer. Bad impression on the locals, I bet. Anyway, how'd they try to fix their? Sorry, go ahead. Oh, yep, that's my fault. Too big. Yeah.
I don't know, but like, what would Australia care about rats? Animals already that perhaps
They do, but it turns out none of them like to eat rats. And the rats absolutely overran the place. So, you know what their solution was? This is where I highly recommend today with some of these scenarios you're not entirely sure on, look them up because you can absolutely find out what happened.
they introduce a predator.
Yeah. They brought cats. You know what they have now? They have a cat problem. They have feral cats everywhere, right? So it's good to kind of do your homework before you try to fix something. And one of the ways we do that is our second concept, which is ecosystem modeling. And by ecosystem models, I do not mean the diorama of a rainforest that you built in sixth grade or whatever grade it was. What I mean is math. I mean, in ecosystem modeling, we're actually trying to describe the way the ecosystem works using math, using equations. Very much a computer-assisted field these days. Because what you want is to be able to model what you want to do. You know, if Australians had had good ecosystem modeling, maybe they would have realized that, hey, cats don't have any natural predators in Australia either. So we're just creating problem number 2, right? So this is definitely the pea and con pit. This is like we use these models so we don't have to experiment on the real thing. What's going to happen as fresh water runs out in this ecosystem? What's going to happen as the average temperature goes up in coral reef? These are all questions you can answer if your math is good. And so a lot of the things we'll be studying in this chapter are the things you have to understand to start to model an ecosystem. Things like how does energy go through? We'll study what are called trophic levels, which you've heard of before. This is where food webs and food chains come in. We'll study energy pyramids, which show us how energy gets lost from level to level. How do species influence each other? We'll talk about those relationships. competition, predation, and symbiosis. Those species that live so closely together they can't help but affect each other. Then there's non-living stuff. Water, carbon, and nitrogen that every living thing needs. Well, how do those non-living nutrients get into ecosystems? And then when things die, how do they get back out? So we'll study the water cycle and the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. All this stuff. And much more to have a good ecosystem model. And your model is never going to be perfect. Australia is a great example of that. The rat-cat problem is far from the only thing that has been screwed up in Australia. And it's not necessarily their fault. Part of it is that Australia is a weird place. Ecologically, it's an island, a very large island, but it's split off from the main continents. You know, that whole Gondwana land, Pangea thing. It's split off of there way early in the history of life. And it's been evolving independently ever since. So there's actually a pretty low diversity there. There's not that many things there. So disturbances, they have a harder time recovering from. Also, for some reason, they have all the most poisonous stuff on Earth. I don't know why. It's probably a good biological reason. I just don't know it. Anyway, those are the two concepts of the day. Diversity, in other words, the ability of an ecosystem, because it's got more different living things to recover, and some are adapted to survive any disturbance, and modeling, which is what we use to try and figure out what's going to happen when we do disturb ecosystems. Questions? How'd you do Friday on those on the scenarios? Did you get halfway through? 3/4 of the way through? Today is to get the rest of the way through. We will start tomorrow with about 5 minutes to kind of put the finishing touches on, and then your groups will be presenting their slides. Not all of them. I'll just pick one for you to present, so make sure you're strong on all of them. Gavin. Yeah, I gave you the remote assignment, right? Yep, you're on your own for those 3 slides.